Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be building an API using Kotlin and Spring Boot, and we're going to compare that side by side with what we built using Swift and Vapor in a recent video. If that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. Let's learn together. Alright, so we will start by using IntelliJ by JetBrains. It's an IDE that is specifically designed for Kotlin and Spring Boot development. If you just do a Google search for downloading IntelliJ, you should land on something that looks similar to this page. Now, of course, they've got their paid product up front, but we don't need that for our demo. For our example, we can use the Community Edition. And so we will download this file, and then we will bring the video back once that file is done downloading. All right, we've got IntelliJ downloaded, and now our next step is to create a Spring project. So we'll go to start.spring.io, and we will start choosing our settings. So as you can see here, we want a Gradle Kotlin project, and the language, of course, is Kotlin for that. And then the version of Spring Boot, they're always making newer versions and updates to this, so it may be different by the time you watch this video. But right now, 3.4.5 is the latest stable release, and so we'll choose that option. And then our group, it uses reverse domain name notation, and so I will use io.jpmtech because I own that website. And then we will choose our artifact name, and so let's name this Kotlin Greeting Service. There we go. And change that back to lowercase. There we are. All right, and this is a demo project for Spring Boot, so that's just fine. And we do want a jar, and Java 21 again is the latest stable, and so we'll leave that there. And now we don't need any dependencies directly from our Spring initializing project here, so we will go ahead and click Generate. All right, and now we will meet back up whenever we've got our IntelliJ open, and we will choose to open our Kotlin Greeting Service project here in IntelliJ. All right, so now we've got IntelliJ open, and we've clicked our Open button here to open a new project, and we've navigated into our Kotlin Greeting Service, and we are ready to open this project. Now, if this is the first time you've ever opened a Gradle project, it may take a few seconds for Gradle to build, as you can see down here. But I've opened Gradle projects before, so it shouldn't be too bad of a wait. There we are. Looks like it's already ready to go. Nice. So let's expand our project file here and see what we've got. So we've got our project with our main file here, and we'll go to that in just a second. The first thing we want to do, however, is we want to add in a few dependencies. So by default, these are the dependencies that are included with the Spring project, but we want to change these slightly. The first thing we want to do is we want to change this from Spring Boot Starter to Spring Boot Starter-Web, so that's an easy one. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to add a new dependency, and so we will add a new implementation of our SpringDoc with the OpenAPI Starter MVC. And so what this does is this brings in SpringDoc, which will automatically generate some docs for us, and this will help us with our OpenAPI documentation by default without us having to do much of anything, as you'll see here in just a second. Now, as of this writing, the latest version that I found for the SpringDoc project is 2.8.6, and so we will add that here. Now, if you are watching this in the future and you're wondering what the latest version is, you can copy this, which I will link in the description below. You can copy this implementation and find it in the Maven repository. And as we can see here, 2.8.6 is the latest stable version. So that's what we'll stick with. All right, so now back in our project, we can see that we've got a Gradle sync that needs to occur. And this little icon will float here until that sync happens. So let's go ahead and let's let it sync our project. And what that's doing is that's downloading the new dependencies that we've got and updating this one here and replacing it with the version that we actually want. All right, and with those dependencies out of the way, we are ready to run our project for the first time. So let's go back into our main project file. And as you can see, we don't have any configuration selected up here yet. So we will click on this little play button here beside the main function, and we will say that we want to run our Kotlin greeting service. And that will build all of our Gradle files and should get everything up and running and ready to go. And as you can see now, we have our Kotlin greeting service set up and ready. And we can take this configuration and click on the Edit button, and we will store those settings here by clicking Apply and then OK. Now it won't forget what we ask it to do whenever we're ready to run our application. All right, now we are officially ready to start writing some code. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new package, and this package is going to be a models package. And inside the models package, we're going to create a new file that is a Kotlin data class, and we want this to be called greeting response. There we go. And this greeting response is just going to be a message that is a string. There we are. With that, that's the only response we're going to do that will be a JSON response. Our other response will just be a plain string, as you'll see here in just a second. So let's go ahead and let's create that controller. So we'll go back to our main project here and create a new package and call this controllers. And then we will create a new file inside of our controller package, and this file will be called API service. Let's make it API controller. There we are. All right, now we've got a controller here, but Spring doesn't know that it's a REST controller. So let's let Spring know that we want this to be a REST controller. There we go. And now I've got those auto imports turned on, which is a really nice feature to have if you've never used it in Android Studio or IntelliJ. By the way, both are built by JetBrains, and so it's the same settings for both. But you can go to Settings in your project, scroll down to Editor, and then under General, there's an auto import setting, and you will see that Add Unambiguous Imports on the Fly is selected, and we also like to select Optimize Imports on the Fly. This top one will add any imports that it can figure out on its own. The bottom one will remove any unused imports. So let's go ahead and let's click Apply, and then OK. All right. So now that we've got those auto imports set up, we're ready to keep going with the rest of our project. Now, we've told Spring that this is a REST controller, but we haven't said what path this controller lives at. And to do that, we will add another annotation that is a request mapping for /API. There we are. And again, it automatically brought that in, which was nice. Okay, and now that we're in the API controller, we want to create a greeting. And this will greet anyone that passes their name in as a query parameter. So let's do that. Let's say that we want a function that gets a greeting. And that greeting will take a request parameter that has a value where the key, and so this is actually the key that it will get out of the query params, and that key we will also reference as a name inside our code, and that is of type string. So the way this works is this is the actual name of the query parameter itself, and this is the name that we will reference inside of our function that we're going to declare here in just a second. So let's go ahead and do that. And so inside of our function, we just want to return our greeting response, and the message that we're going to pass is hello to the name of the user that was passed in. And it's that simple. Now, our get greeting, we don't know, if we just called /API, we don't know how to actually access this get greeting here directly. And so we want to let Spring know that this is a get mapping, and it is /greet. There we are. And so now whenever we hit our endpoint, we will go to /API/greet and we pass in a name query parameter and give that parameter a value, and that value will be displayed in our response. And this is fussing at us right now because we haven't told it that we are going to return anything. So let's let our function know that this method returns a string. This method returns a greeting response. There we are. Nice. And now we will stop and rebuild our project so that it has this new greet endpoint. And we should see started down here in our terminal. There we are. All right, and now let's open Postman. Now this Postman has data from our Swift and Vapor project, and so we can use these exact same endpoints to try out our greeting service. And again, if you haven't watched that video, go back and check it out once you're done with this one. It's pretty good. So let's send our request. Nice, and we got a 200 with the message, hello Jane, and Jane was the value of the name that we passed in. Very cool. All right, now the next thing we need is to get an emoji. So let's go ahead and let's do that. Let's create a new function that is a get mapping, and this will be to /emoji, and this function we will call get emoji. Very creative. And it won't take any parameters, and it will return a string. There we are. All right. Now I don't remember all the emojis that were originally in our Swift and Vapor project, so let's go copy those out really quickly. Let's just get this string here of emojis. There we are. And so we will say val emojis is a list of the strings. Now Kotlin isn't as great with Unicode characters as Swift is, and so because of that we will create a list of strings rather than pass it in just one long string. And that way we can still get a similar response with nearly identical code. Not exactly the same, but nearly identical. All right, so now we have a list of emojis, and we will return one of the emojis dot random. There we are. And now we are returning a random emoji in our endpoint. So let's go back to Postman, and let's use this same endpoint that we created for our Swift project and see what we get whenever, oh, we've got to rebuild, almost forgot that. There we are, start a Kotlin service. All right, so let's go back to Postman and let's send our endpoint. There we are, we got a 200 and it looks like we got a waving hand. Very cool. Now earlier we said that we were going to include some docs using SpringDoc into our project. So how do we access those? Well, with our project running, we will go back to our greetings, our API controller there. With our project running, we will go to localhost 8080 /swagger-ui/index.html. So now that we've got it pasted here, we can just command click and jump straight there in the browser. There we are. All right, and as you can see, we have, without having to write any special documentation ourselves, we have our greet endpoint, and it shows that it returns a 200. It doesn't quite know the media type, but it does know that we're returning a greeting response. And our emoji endpoint also knows about the 200. Again, hasn't quite figured out the media type, but says that we're returning a string, which is accurate. But what if we wanted to run this code and have our docs look exactly like our Swift docs? And that means being able to do things like having a nice descriptive name here or a nice description here and making sure that our media types are okay. Now for that we can use a Swagger annotation. Now you might notice that these are again Swagger docs that are a nicely formatted version of our OpenAPI docs. But Swagger has annotations that we can add to our code that allow us to clean this UI up a little bit and be a little bit more descriptive than the default documentation that we get for free. And so let's go back over to our project and let's start adding some of those annotations. Now each of those annotations goes above whatever class or method that you're trying to annotate. So for this one, we will say that there is an @API response. And yes, we want to include the import the Swagger response. And that takes a response code, and that response code is going to be 200 for our happy path, which is the only path that we're covering in this scenario. And then it takes content. So that content is an array of a few different things. And so we will pass in our content object that is a Swagger annotations media. There we are. And now what we want to do is we want to pass in our media type, which in the first case of our greeting response is application/JSON, because it is an application JSON type. And then the next thing we want is our schema. And our schema, again, is the annotations media schema. And inside of here, we pass in the implementation, which takes a Kotlin class, and that implementation is our greeting response class. There we are. And now, if we rebuild our project, and we can jump back over to our docs and refresh the page here. If we look at our greeting, we now see that it knows that it's an application JSON type. Very cool. And it knows that it's a 200 OK. All right. Now there are some other options that we can add to this to just make it just a little bit cleaner. For example, the description is missing in our 200 response. So we could come back over to our Apple code, and we can use our OpenAPI docs, and we can say that a 200 is a success response with a greeting. And so we will add our description here. Whoops, not there. We actually want to add it below our response code. Description is a successful response with a greeting. Nice. And then we can also do the same type of thing for our emoji endpoint. So let's do that. And so let's go back over and we'll get our description for our emoji endpoint, which is a success response. Which is a success response with an emoji. And so we'll replace this for our emoji content. There we go. And this isn't going to be an application JSON. This is a text plain response. Now the implementation of our schema is a little bit different on this one. It is a schema with a type that is string. There we go. And now if we rerun our project, we should be able to go back to our browser here and refresh our page. There we are. So now we see a success response with a greeting for our greet endpoint, and for our emoji endpoint, it says a success response with an emoji, and our media type is correct, and so is our example. Nice. And with that, we are ready to look at both projects side by side. So let's go ahead and let's get our browser out of the way, and we will close our project navigator. Because with this, a small amount of code, we already have everything we need to get our project working. And even the docs that match, which is very cool. Now one thing you can do is you can, before we get all the way out of the browser, you can command click on this, and that'll open up the API documentation directly, and it's in a JSON format, which I actually prefer over the YAML format, just because whenever you paste this into Xcode, you can auto format with the built-in formatter, since it knows that it's a JSON project, which is a very nice feature over the YAML configuration that we used in our project earlier. All right, and with that out of the way, let's take these projects and let's look at them side by side. So let's slide this over here, and then our Xcode project, nice, it's already right there. So as we can see here, our Xcode project is having a little bit of trouble with the OpenAPI stuff just because it isn't built in directly to the file. No worries, just another rebuild will fix those errors right up. So let's go back to our main project and rebuild. There we are. See, now they're all cleaned up. Now, the difference between these two, in the Swift and Vapor implementation, we had to write all our documentation first, which honestly is probably a really good policy because then you know for a fact that your documentation is going to be your ideal path, and then your code will just have to match that ideal path. This could make your code a little bit more complicated, but it also means that your documentation is guaranteed to always be correct. Whereas whenever we were building this same project in Kotlin, we were able to build our code and we didn't have to write any extra documentation if we didn't want to. The documentation that we got for free was actually pretty close. It just needed a few extra niceties to know, for example, the media type that was returned, the specific classes or types that were returned, those kinds of things. So there's obviously trade-offs with every decision that you make, but just keep these in mind as you're building and deciding these projects on your own. The other thing is you may be super familiar with Swift, or you may be really familiar with Kotlin. And so that's going to also play into a big decision factor on which one of these two you would actually end up using in your production code. It may just be faster to go with what you know than it would be to learn something new. Another consideration is that Spring is actually a significantly more mature product, I would argue, than Vapor. It seems to have been around a lot longer than Vapor has. I've only started hearing about Vapor being used on production products a lot more recently, whereas Spring has been around since I believe the mid-2000s. So there's lots of support for it, and it's been around the block a time or two. Now, don't discount the Apple OpenAPI stuff just because we followed the instructions and used a YAML file here. You're actually more than welcome to use a JSON file here from everything that I've read. And it should be just the same as the documentation that we were looking at over here in our browser. It should just be this exact same code that you could paste over into the Swift project. And then, of course, make a few minor changes like updating this from YAML to JSON, that kind of thing, to let your project know. So that would fix the slightly weird indentation issues that Swift format doesn't know how to deal with already. But again, that's just another trade-off decision that you'll have to make. And now it actually doesn't matter a whole lot what you end up going with, as long as you feel like you are making the right decision and you are able to stick with your decision. The trouble comes in when learning new technologies, when you're bouncing back and forth between one or the other, and you're not sticking with one thing. It's always really helpful to get good with one project and with one technology before you start expanding out to other technologies and other tech stacks. And with that, let me know in the comments below which one you prefer. If you're a huge fan of Swift with Vapor and using Swift on server, or if you prefer Kotlin and Spring Boot, let me know that too. If you have never used any of these projects, let me know too, which one you're actually looking forward to trying. And with that, feel free to like, subscribe, and share, and leave a comment. Like I said, just be nice about it. That's all I ask. Thanks. Have a great day.